Welcome to Love Your Job, Love Your Life podcast. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Richard Reid. Slightly different one, this one. Richard is actually a psychologist by background and is now business consultant. So we're going to have some interesting conversation here, Richard, but welcome to the podcast. We were just talking before we started this to go, how can we start this podcast?
We thought about silence, but then we figured that people might tune out. So we decided not to risk it.
So we had 5 seconds of silence there, Richard. But yeah, so look, today, something that I talk about an awful lot when I talk about the engagement and engaging with people, whether you're a manager, a leader, or you're trying to engage yourself. The power of silence is often really critical to the success. And I talk to people about it to find their silence. And we thought that it would be a really interesting conversation to talk about silence in more detail, because it's something that people really don't. We talk about it and people get it in the world of sales. Don't jump in until the other person says something. But let's talk about it through a different lens today, Richard. And why? Let's start with a very broad question. Why is there a need, in your opinion, why is there a need for more time for silence in the world that we live in today?
I think simply put, life is so fast, isn't it? And it's very easy to get transactional about situations. And what that means is not only do we not allow people to express themselves and for us to actually see them for who they are and understand more about their world, but also it doesn't give us time to reflect otherwise. So we don't recognize how we feel. We don't recognize what we're bringing to a conversation unintentionally, perhaps. So it allows us just to be more informed, more mindful, more purposeful in everything we do.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was at a HR conference last week, actually, in Birmingham. And, one of the things, it was a conversation around, and it wasn't AI versus human connection, because that's unfair. It was AI and human connection. But one of the things that we talked about an awful lot at that conference was exactly that. The speed of change that is happening in the world today. I mean, you blink and you miss something. It's one of those things that, especially, and I'm going to say the younger generation, Gen Z's coming through, they're so used to this speed of change, this speed of transaction, that it's about, how do we just keep going? And it's like we're on this treadmill, right, that just doesn't stop. And that's what you're saying, that says actually that's why silence why it's needed, is because that treadmill just isn't stopping.
Absolutely. Obviously there's lots of different models for how the brain works, but the one I like is the model by Daniel Kahneman, and he talks about system 1 and system 2. And if we're doing everything fast and we're doing everything immediately, we're very much in system 1. System 1 is all very impulse driven. It's very sort of default knee-jerk responses, whereas system 2 is more informed, it's more nuanced, it's not objectifying people, it's seeing people for who they are, or at least showing genuine curiosity for who they are, rather than taking a cookie-cutter approach to how we deal with people. And that's massively important if you want to open things up in any walk of life.
Yeah. And that's where probably this human connection thing that we were talking about at the conference last week was very much that, this virtual world that we also live in, and this, this virtual world that we're doing this podcast in, Richard, we are losing that. It's a debate. Are we losing that human connection that enables us to sit opposite each other? Because, and again, when we think about that from a silence perspective, it's very easy when you're in front of somebody, you can see them thinking, and therefore they need that silence. Whereas in this environment, it's much harder. And it's in this environment, especially when you've got a Teams call or a Zoom call or whatever platform you're using, and you've got 6 people on that screen, you can't sense that energy or that thought process that's in the room that you would get when you're together in the same room, right?
Absolutely. And I think for me, the other thing about this kind of environment is people tend to pack in more meetings than they ever did before. So by its very nature, things are faster, they're more transactional, right? What are we here to discuss? Conversations aren't happening as organically. And you don't have that kind of reflection time when you're going from the meeting room to your desk. It's on to the next meeting. So it's not good in terms of our well-being, our reflection, our connection with other people. So for all those reasons, it provides additional challenges. And I think the other aspect of it as well is that as human beings, we're increasingly conditioned to give people the abridged version of a situation, whether it's what we're feeling or what's happening, or perception on it. And silence is incredible in some ways, because actually it's giving people that opportunity to say that a little bit more. And sometimes they're saying things that they haven't even fully connected with themselves. And, you know, for me, as somebody coming from a therapy background, that's massively important. I remember training as a therapist and how uncomfortable it was sitting with silence. But actually, some of the biggest insights and connections that I have with clients are when I just use my instinct to hold back a little bit. People say things that are revealing for me, but for them as well, they hear it. They see my reaction to it. They hear me reflect on what they've just said, and they connect with it at a deeper level.
Yeah. And actually, I was at a men's circle event a few weeks back, and I go to it quite regularly. But when you exactly as you're talking about, when you're in that scenario, we spend a lot of time in silence, and we spend a lot of time just being connected with another human being in silence. And then we also spend time listening and active listening. So you're truly listening to the person that you're sat opposite. And at the end of it, there is no solutioning, there is no fixing, there is no commentary. You just go back into silence again, and the power of that is huge. It's huge. It really is huge. So look, we've touched on a few bits. We've touched on tech, we've touched on teams and working from home and those bits. But one of the things that when I'm doing coaching with people and I'm talking about my Engage to Succeed model and where people are on the model, and often one of the levels on there is a roller coaster ride, which goes back to this doing piece all the time, constantly doing. And you have up days, good days, bad days, good mornings, bad mornings, and you're kind of on this cycle. And often I talk to people that I'm coaching or in a workshop, I'm talking to them about how to get off that roller coaster. What in your view, what is stopping people from finding that time to connect? And we've touched on the busy world and all those other bits and pieces, but let's explore that a bit more, Richard. What are you seeing that's stopping people finding that time for themselves and that silence?
Interesting question. I think there's a few things. I guess the things that immediately come to mind. One is people want more from life. They want to be all things. You know, we see this with a lot of people. Working mothers is a classic example. So actually they're trying to develop a career and also trying to be everything at home as well. So we're packing more and more into our time. And what happens is it almost becomes like an addiction for the brain. And we feel guilty when we've got the opportunity for downtime. We're looking around for other things to do. And the brain often finds it hard to adjust from one mode of operating to another at the flick of a switch. It takes time to decompress. So, you know, if you're flat out Monday to Friday, it's not as simple as saying, well, it's Saturday, I'm going to relax. The brain takes a while to get out of that groove. So these are some of the things that often play a part. But, you know, guilt plays a massive part. People often feel uncomfortable. People feel uncomfortable with their feelings. Silence means we have to sit with our feelings. Not doing things, at least not outwardly doing things, means we've got to sit with our feelings. A lot of people get their validation from doing things and getting the acknowledgement that they're busy. So all of these things, I think, play a part in what we do. But actually, when you're on the go all the time, you don't necessarily reflect on your condition. It's only when you step out of it. How many times when people have an enforced break, or when they go on holiday, do they realise, wow, actually, I didn't realise that was affecting me so much? The brain goes into coping mode. It doesn't realise the impact things are having.
Yeah. And when you do go on holiday and you're in that environment, it often takes you, I remember back to when I was working 100 miles an hour, and it still takes you 2 or 3 days to kind of readjust, which is exactly what you're saying from a psychological perspective, of the brain's still in that processing mode of getting up early, working, keep going. And it's only when you 2 or 3 days in, you start to actually, your body starts to, I suppose your nervous system gets to a point where it's relaxation, and therefore you can back off. Just on that point, you mentioned there about working parents, and working parents is very, you kind of move from one thing to another all the time, and that doesn't stop. But there's also, for me, something that's close to my heart is men's mental health. And this is quite if you've got some insights from your research and your knowledge, but and more men that I'm talking to, and that like the men's circle that I go to, and various other things, inherently men are probably, I don't know whether they're worse at this than women, but we certainly don't like to sit, and sitting with ourselves and sitting in silence is very difficult, as you've already highlighted. Is there anything that you, from your research and that you've done, that I suppose is biologically different men to women, that makes it harder? Because men are opening up more, Richard, which is I love to see, and I always encourage them to do so. But inherently, it's not really a trait that men do very well. So
I think that's true.
There?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think you're quite right. Historically, men have found it difficult to acknowledge, and even more so to speak outwardly about what's going on for them. So actually doing things is a way of masking that. And that sometimes involves self-medication as well. Drinking is a way of blocking out the emotions, isn't it? So, these are the kind of things that men traditionally fall back on, that then create their own problems as well. But I think, if you also look, and again, this is a bit of a sweeping generalization, but if you look at traditional roles within society, men are meant to be, or perceived to be, the go-getters. So actually that is socialized in a lot of men from a very early age, not necessarily on a conscious level. So actually, I've got to be doing things to justify my existence. And whilst there absolutely is some of that for women as well, I think often women are more connected with what they're giving to other people, the emotional aspects of things that men tend to be. Men tend to find that actually they're not doing things, they're questioning their validity. So it can apply to both genders, but I think probably more so for men. And it tends to convert to unhealthy behaviours when there's not an outlet for that.
Yeah. And what I see quite a lot of is, you're absolutely right. I mean, men struggle to openly talk about their emotions, their feelings, take time to and we'll talk about decompression in a minute, but they struggle to go and find times because they feel guilty because they're not doing. What I'm seeing is, there's two kind of parts to this that are becoming really alarming for me. One is that actually women are becoming more affected by this, where the pressures of their entire being, their world, become greater and greater and greater. Again, we were talking about it last week at the conference, but more and more women are working, they're growing hierarchically, they're getting the big jobs, which is brilliant to see that they are now at the table. But they are also struggling with the pressures of work, family, life, exactly the same as men are. Maybe they're probably more open, but even they're starting to put masks on and trying to hide it from their friends, their family, their colleagues, because there is this image of, I'm the chief people officer, I have to be available, I have to be visible, I can't show weakness because I'm at the table. What I'm seeing is it's becoming more and more it's almost becoming more and more job specific than gender specific. Which again is quite an interesting discussion point, because actually something needs to fundamentally change in the world here, because we're creating more and more pressure on people, and it doesn't matter about gender. It's actually that pressure is the problem, and that's the boiling pot that is exploding. It is exploding because we're getting burnout, mental health issues. All of this stuff is becoming more and more prominent in today's society. The second part of it that's really worrying for me is it's happening at a younger generation. The 16 to 24-year-olds that are now entering the workplace, and they've been brought up with this constant need for information, data, mobiles, technology, and there is just no break in their world. Probably even less of a break in their world compared to our world in the world of work at a senior level, right?
Yeah.
So there's some real issues there. So look, we've talked about some of these issues, and they are genuine issues, Richard. We've mentioned a couple of things around, decompression. Let's explore decompression, but how do we prioritize this in this world where the Gen Z are used to being constantly connected, how do we prioritize this and help people to kind of step back from doing things 100 miles an hour and doing and doing and doing and doing and doing and doing and doing?
Yeah.
How do we help them?
Well, I think going back to the point you were making before, I think some of it is about people showing genuine vulnerability. So it's, you can still be somebody who's an inspiration to other people and an effective person, but sometimes acknowledging your own challenges, whether they're current or historical, gives other people an invitation to reflect on their situation and maybe to openly acknowledge some of those things. I think when we're not talking about these things, particularly younger people looking at older people, there's often these messages, well, this is how I need to be if I want to get on in life, or I want to get on in my career. So, I do a lot of work in the corporate arena, and a big part of that is about creating this idea of psychological safety. How do I encourage organizations to create an environment where people can speak up, whether it's because they don't understand something, they made a mistake, or actually I'm struggling. So for me, there's that big piece that needs to happen. But I think as individuals, we also need to set the positive intention to make change. It's not just going to land in your lap. You've got to create that space. And even if you're very busy, so, again, working in the corporate environment, people say, well, I'm too busy to make changes. And I say to people, even if you're going from back-to-back Zoom calls to more Zoom calls, even just 30 seconds of setting the intention to pause, to acknowledge how you're feeling, allows you to adjust. And it might mean, even if you've got to go into that next meeting, that you make an adjustment later in the day. Or you think, well, actually, I didn't realize I'm so tired. I'm going to rejig some things, or I'm going to take it a little bit quieter tomorrow. It allows us to use a little bit more nuance in how we operate, rather than I'm a robot and this is what I need to do.
Yeah. And the corporate world is challenging today because, work from home is here to stay. And I can't ever see us going back to pre-2020 environments where, 80% of the workforce are in an office or in some kind of building that is owned by the business, i.e. retail shops. So work from home is here to stay. And therefore this becomes, in my opinion, even more important because I don't have the answer to this, Richard, in any way, shape or form. But if I think about my last role in the corporate world where I was the director of TA, I had complete autonomy over my diary, and so if I wasn't feeling it, I could block an hour in my diary and not feel guilty about it, just to take some reflection time or to take a step back. Or if I wanted to go for a walk at lunchtime, I didn't care that my light went red or amber, probably amber, or it then said away from desk, whatever it said, can't remember. But, I was less worried about it because of the seniority I had in the business. And I knew that I was putting in the hours and that, I was doing what I needed to do to be successful. But unfortunately, as you went down, and I'm going to talk hierarchy here, as you go down through a hierarchy in a business, the further down you go, the more conscious people are about doing these things. And the more conscious people are about saying, I need to step away, or I need to go and do this or do that. And this notion of lunch break seems to have disappeared from people's vocabulary and working lives because of this interconnectivity around you're working from home, you can't be seen to be away, et cetera, et cetera. So, is there things that we can be doing to help organizations to say, look, this is the organization that has to drive this, right? Not the individual. Or is it the other way around? Or is it the manager that has to help drive it? Where do you see the responsibility sitting here?
It's an interesting one. I think it's probably a bit of both, but I think, if you're talking particularly about sort of more junior members of staff, inevitably they are going to feel more vulnerable. They don't have that level of autonomy or authority. So actually they need that encouragement from further up the chain. So some of that is more senior people modeling healthier behaviors. It might also be about managers just keeping an eye on more junior members of staff. So I notice you've been working through quite a few lunchtimes lately, or I notice you've been doing a lot of hours after work. Can you make sure you take a break today? We'll work around it. But it's interesting. A lot of people don't respect people's lunchtime. they'll just put a diary entry in there when they might know that somebody's taking lunch. So actually checking with people, is it okay? Is this in your lunch break? Are you okay? We have a meeting now. Negotiating those things rather than making assumptions gives people more permission to be honest about what's going on for them. But I think when people do have a degree of autonomy, I think it's almost about thinking about what are your non-negotiables, what are the things that you need to keep you in a good place, and almost blocking them in the diary like they're a business meeting. So going to the gym, going for a walk and a sandwich, they don't have to be wild and wonderful things, but it's actually I am setting the intention and I'm letting other people know that I'm not available during this time. And actually, yes, you lose an hour of the day, but you're going to be more effective when you are working. And I think that's really important for organisations to think about, because there still is this element of Victorian mentality, isn't it? That actually your effectiveness is based on the number of hours that you do. It's not. I know people that work lots of hours, but they're not very good at what they do. There's other people who work less hours, and part of the reason they work less hours is because they're very good and they're efficient.
Yeah. And I mentioned the roller coaster ride earlier. I reckon 50% of the working population are on a roller coaster ride at any one time in the day. And when you break it down and you start talking to them, and one of the biggest issues for being on a roller coaster ride is I talk about passion. But it's the lack of passion in what you're doing that drives you down onto a roller coaster ride than flying high, which is what I would call true engagement. And it's all of these things that you've just talked about, that it's kind of, I talk about what's in your control and what's out of your control, but everything that's in your control, you have control over. And if that is a lunchtime walk, if that is yoga, if that is run, if that is reading or even knitting, it doesn't really matter. It's finding that passion or finding something that brings you joy that then helps you in the afternoon, let's say, to raise your game, but it helps you in the afternoon to feel more energized about what you're doing. We've talked a few times, Richard. I want to talk about this decompression time, because this is something that always comes up when I'm coaching people or running training courses. I talk about decompression time all the time, and I joke now about it because when people work from home, I say, "Oh, you've got the 1 second commute," and they look at me and go, "What? What do you mean 1 second commute, James?" I went, "Yeah, you've got the 1 second commute, which is the amount of time it takes you to close your laptop down." And they laugh and joke and go, "Oh yeah," but this is part of the problem. Again, which I think, when we talked about it before, Richard, this is the decompression time, right? Let you explain, because you've mentioned it, I've mentioned it, but what do you call the decompression time, and why is it so important?
Well, I definitely buy into this idea, and I talk about the idea of transitions, and it's a blessing and a curse working from home, is it? Because actually, you can walk out the door and you're in your other life. You don't have an hour's commute to get home, but actually, you're missing an opportunity for a transition. You're going straight from what might have been a very fast-paced operation to something where maybe you need to be emotionally engaged, and it's quite hard, and it can cause all kinds of problems off the back of it. Having a little bit of time is really, really important. So that might be, actually, I'm just going to have half an hour when I finish my work, just to sit with the book, just to do something that I find relaxed and enjoyable before I go into that other world. So that's really important. But I think even when you don't have the luxury of that, even when you've got to rush from work to do something with the kids or whatever it might be, you still have opportunities to influence your transition. So even the pace at which you move at, the way in which you breathe, they're almost so small and obvious that we don't consider them. But these also inform how we then operate in that next environment and how quickly we come down from that stress level. So even if you can't alter the time that you've got between one event and another, how you engage with it in terms of breathing, your movement, has a big bearing on how you then perceive it and how you come across.
Yeah. But you know what? That's something that I've never thought of, is that transition, the speed at which you transition, the speed in which you do things, the way you breathe. Because when you're in work mode, and I smile when I say that, because my mum always says, "Oh, James, you've got into work mode." And but you do, you speak quicker, you, depending on your role and what you're doing, but you speak quicker, you're much more often much more direct. You don't have that calm, often that calm, empathetic side that you would have with your kids when you were at work.
And you don't notice it because all you hear is the words. Well, like, what did I say that was so bad? But it's as you say, it's the way that you say it, the voice, the pace, the body language, all these things that they ultimately causes more problems because we end up upsetting people, or our messages fall flat. Taking the time to focus on it is really, really important. But the point you're making there, I think sometimes pace is infectious, isn't it? So I often think about when I visit London. Sometimes I'll catch myself and I'll check myself. Why are you walking so fast? And it's not because I need to be somewhere by a particular time. It's because I've got drawn into everybody else's pace. So again, taking these opportunities to just catch ourselves during the course of the working day allows us to be more deliberate and purposeful about how we use our energy.
Yeah. And it's the same from a management or a leadership perspective. Whenever I talk to people about leading or managing, I've talked about this a lot. Great leaders will change their energy, change their style, change their mannerisms to the person that they are leading. And okay, you'll have a dominant approach when you're leading a bigger group of people, but there's whichever assessment you use, there's loads of them. But I always go to the colors one because, if you're a dominant red and your majority of the people you're talking to is a green, you have to change. Otherwise your message isn't going to land. But it's the same with what we're talking about here with decompression and moving from one environment to another. You have to often fundamentally change. So it's an interesting way to look at it, is that transition process.
Definitely. And I think the other thing about this for me is introverts, and you think that the world is often geared towards extroverts, people who talk quickly, they talk out loud as they're thinking, and again when we're not registering our energy and the emotion we're giving off, we're not thinking about the person who's in front of us, and we're not creating space and pauses and silence. Those people who've perhaps got really useful insights often get overlooked because they need time to reflect. They've already answered the next point. It's gone.
Yeah. And that's, again, it's so true, irrelevant of the environment that you're in. It's all about giving people the right amount of time to be able to think, consider, and come back with the right thoughts. So, Richard, I think we could talk about this all day, but I think what I think is critical here is, and I'll give you some time to summarize. But what I'm taking from this, and it's something that I talk about a lot, which is we have to recognize it, and we have to sit with it, and we have to be kind to ourselves to make sure that we are giving ourselves the opportunity to almost recenter to a degree and rebalance ourselves. And whether you're a 100 miles an hour extrovert or you're an introvert at the other end of the scale, silence is important to everybody, especially in the world that we live in today, which is 100 miles an hour, always on, always connected, etc. And so, that's why this is such a fascinating topic for me. But what would your closing remarks be around silence and for those that are listening?
Well, I think for me, it's about trying to be more intentional in everything you do. So absolutely, silence has a place in that repertoire. But sometimes people don't want silence. Sometimes people do want a fast conversation. But it's about recognizing what the situation needs and having the wherewithal to bring that to bear, rather than when we're operating at pace, when we're under stress, just giving people our default response. It's objectifying people, it's objectifying situations. And that's what we need to try and work away from, for us and for other people.
Very good. And look, and I suppose from a management leadership perspective, and you do sort of business consultancy in the corporate world the same as I do, but from a leadership management perspective, it's also the recognition that, and I talk about this from an engagement perspective, everyone's different, everyone needs something different, and therefore it's about recognizing, and I use the word audience, recognizing who your audience is and making sure you are supporting and helping them to be the best they can be. And that could be to give them some silence. That could be to help them or support them. It could be to recognize that they're on the verge of burnout before they recognize they're on the verge of burnout. It's all of those things. So from a leader or manager perspective, it's equally important, but it's that support piece that helps them, right?
So. Absolutely. And being in command and aware of your own emotions gives you the spare capacity to think about what other people might need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, if we haven't got that, all we do is we go through the motions.
Yeah. 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 Richard, it's a fascinating topic. As I say, we could talk about it for hours because I think we're very much aligned from our approach with this.
I think so.
But look, I really appreciate you joining me to talk about this, because I really truly believe that actually the more that people can decompress, the more that people can take a step back, the more that people can have more time for themselves in silence, whether that's 30 seconds, as you say, between two Zoom calls, or whether that's 30 minutes or an hour of meditation in the morning, it really doesn't matter. Silence is a really important part of everybody. And actually, the more that you give yourself time, the more that you actually will find out what truly makes you tick and what will help you to love your job and help you love your life more every day, which is what the aim of this podcast is all about. So, Richard, I really thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great discussion, and I hope everyone that's watched it has taken away some great tips and hints.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Richard.